the boys back home. Here we are at Bring the Boys Back Home. You know what that means, right? Comfortably Numb is right around the corner. And if you want to go ahead and listen to that first listen, as well as all the rest to the end of the album, you can always find them on my Ko-fi and Patreon. Now, of course, when we are all anticipating such a great one coming up, there's the risk of not giving enough attention to what precedes it. We're simply so eager to get to the big stuff. This is just a short one, right? Maybe we can just hurry through it, right? But be careful. This one is perhaps more important than we think. And in fact, Roger Waters said in the 1979 interview about this album that Bring the Boys Back Home is the central song on the whole album. That's quite a statement. And I'm curious how many of you, if any, if someone were to ask you to identify the central song, the one which carries the core message of the whole album, sums up the entire work, and around which everything else is built, how many of you would choose this song, Bring the Boys Back Home? Does it feel central to your experience of the album? To your understanding and perspective of the work? Well, of course, as I've reiterated throughout this project, good art, and especially great art, can make its statement, convey its message, fulfill its purpose, while still allowing us, the audience, to explore and discover even more beyond what perhaps even the artist had in mind. Allows us to interpret and apply it in multiple ways, depending on our own experiences and perspectives and the context in which it is placed. And so, if it doesn't feel central to you, that's okay. It doesn't mean that your experience and your perspective of the work is wrong. But when an artist makes such a statement about his work, such as, "This is the central song of the whole album," we should sit up and take notice. And so, let's take our time on this one. Let's give it the attention it deserves and see if we can discover some of what it has to offer us. Well, as practically everyone knows, and now myself as well, Waters is legendary for his anti-war stance. And so this should certainly be one of the perspectives we explore. In fact, in his 2010 to 2012 tour of this work, he included the projection of a quote by Eisenhower. It says, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed." It's a powerful quote indeed, and it helps us. It helps to focus our understanding of this work in the direction of its anti-war message. This is Waters' agenda, we could say. Bring the boys back home. Stop robbing the hungry, the cold, the innocent and powerless, the future generations, the children, by conflicts and warfare. And it's an easy one to relate to, especially now, as we all feel the horror of the conflicts going on around the world, and as this album points out, the generations into the future impact that these current conflicts will have. But this song is also about more, much more. And even Roger Waters said way back in his 1979 interview with Vance that it is partly about not letting people go off and be killed in wars, but it's also partly about not allowing rock and roll or making cars or selling soap or getting involved in biological research or anything that anybody might do, not letting that become such an important and jolly boys game that it becomes more important than friends, wives, children, other people. Well, that broadens the application immensely. It turns out there's a whole lot to unpack in here, and by extension, the entire work, since we have to remember this is the central song of the whole album. But before we get lost in the deep end, let's make a little inventory of the outstanding musical elements. It starts off with a recognizable martial style. We hear the marching drums, and as it begins to blossom into this sense of verdant, abundant springtime and growth, we hear triumphant brass, also somewhat militaristic, celebratory strings running up and down the scale. There's the mass chorus and Pink, and I want to point out that it is the chorus plus Pink. Well, I should say it's Roger Waters, but his voice is Pink's voice right here. They are not one and the same. There is the chorus and there is Pink, even though they are singing the same thing. And as the chorus ends, Pink's anguished voice continues. And I'll talk about that more in a little bit. The drums fade into the distance. It's as if the marching army has passed and is moving on into the distance, and then we start to hear the swirling mix of sounds from the past. The teacher's voice, the groupie's question, the phone call, laughter and playground voices, along with a new voice, knocking and calling, "Time to go!" Culminating, after all of that swirl and mix of sounds, in the question, "Is there anybody out there?" Kind of throwing us back to that song earlier in the album. Now, harmonically, it's built on a 4-5-1 progression that repeats throughout. We're in the key of G. The 4 chord of G is, or what we might call the subdominant, is the C chord. That is our first chord. Then it moves to D. That's our 5, the dominant. And then we end up on G, which is the tonic. So we have bring the boys back home. The exact same progression. Bring the boys back home. And then it does something really interesting. The same progression, but it becomes a sort of mirror image. We start with a C. Don't leave the children on their own. Now mirror image back to D. No. And back to C. No. So instead of C, D, G, and stopping there, the phrase goes C, D, G, D, C. It's as if we're staring in a mirror and we see the chords reflecting both directions. And then the final progression, same as always. Bring the boys back home. This time it's E minor. And that is something I want to talk about a bit more. But it's also the home from Hey You. Well, this entire work centers around G, E minor a lot. But we can go ahead and note and observe that this final chord adds an extra note of pathos to the ending, sonically, harmonically, especially as we are hearing Pink's voice, Waters' voice, carrying on long after the chorus ends in that broken-hearted, tragic, fragile tone of utter loneliness and abandonment. Now, this is a good time to remember that the message of this entire work is being presented to us as the tale of a rock musician. And the new voice we hear at the end, Pink's manager, knocking and calling out "time to go," reminds us of that fact. Not every song in the album, in fact, many of them are not explicit as to the fact that this is an operatically told story of a rock musician. But here we find it very clearly embedded within the music and the sound world. And we have to look ahead to the next song to get the full import of the "time to go" summons. But it's interesting to notice that This song, being such a central pillar to the entire work, has none of the classic rock and roll instruments in the orchestra, in any of the instrumental mix that we hear. Even the drums are not given an identifiably rock style or sound. Instead, it's martial and classically orchestral, and the chorus really sounds operatic in style. Why is this? I see several good reasons why, and maybe you will be able to add others as well. But first of all, it tells us that this song is, unlike most of the others in this album, not just showing Pink's viewpoint alone, Pink's perspective and experience. Now, how can we be sure of that? Well, listen to the voices. How many do we hear? It's a whole massed chorus. This is not just the voice going on in Pink's mind, but a mass of people, and I will say real people, each with a voice, each choosing to join their voice in harmony with all the rest around, including with Pink. I'll get back to that in a few minutes. The musical style also communicates to us that not only is it not just about Pink, the rock and roll musician, it emphasizes the dramatic storytelling and symbolism embedded in opera and the classical tradition. The style itself sends us towards that kind of interpretation, reinforcing the fact that we should not view it as merely literal or biographical. And the triumphal martial elements let us know that this is an army. They have a purpose, a goal, a battle to fight and win. But it's not a military operation. It's an army of citizens, an army made up of people of all kinds, from all walks of life, all ages, all various abilities. But it is an army. And this army is on the move, advancing. This battle is one which will end in victory. This is not a defeated army limping back from the front lines. This is an army that is united, strong, hopeful, and with the spirit of conquerors. But it's not necessarily a finished battle. After all, it's not saying, all our boys are home now, let's celebrate. It's not a celebration of something already achieved. Rather, it's a vibrant call to complete a mission. Think about the harmonic shape of the music. It's bold, strong, martial. We have the 4, 5, and 1 chords, which is a very assertive cadential progression. But the final E minor chord lets us feel that it is not quite happily ever after. Not yet. There's work to be done. Just as the lyrics don't claim that the battle is over, so also this triumphal music is crafted in such a way so as not to end on an overly confident note. So, who are these people? What does this chorus signify, really? I think it represents society. The real people who make up the world around us. Our families, our neighbors, the community, the people with whom we belong, among whom we live. In other words, our home. After all, when the chorus is singing, "Bring the boys back home," we understand that wherever they are singing from, that is where the boys are to be brought. They're not saying, send the boys home elsewhere. Bring the boys back home. This is home. And the message is that this army, being the entire population, the society, has the answer for the end of conflict, for the end of war, for the end of all war. Isn't it interesting to encounter this song here after Pink has walled himself off from the world? One of the most fascinating elements to me is this. In the album version, Pink is singing along with the chorus. Or perhaps we should say the chorus is singing along with Pink. Or maybe a better way to describe it is both Pink and the chorus are singing the same thing. In other words, even though Pink is now so completely cut off from society that he can't even hear anyone out there, and even though those who would and could help him can't break through his wall, still, the thing that Pink needs, the thing that his whole life has been crying out for in anguish, is exactly what society around him is trying to accomplish. All the people on the outside of his wall are, even though he doesn't believe it or see it, working towards, calling for exactly the thing that he needs. And now, bringing the movie into our equation, it gets even more interesting. Because in the movie, unlike the album version, we don't hear Pink's voice singing with the chorus. It's a different version of the music. Let's remember that Pink has just reassured himself that the place for him to be is behind the wall, and his new persona is the correct identity for him to have, to own, to live. That was done in the previous song, Vera. And as the scenes for this song begin, we're still seeing Pink's mind as he is revisiting key moments of his life. And now, in the train station, Pink finds a soldier who, from behind, might be his father. He touches him, the soldier turns, and the same scene as what we saw way back at the park is repeated. It's not his father. All fathers are someone else's fathers, but not Pink's. And just as the soldier was about to talk to Pink, his wife with his baby in her arms comes, and the soldier turns to them, forgets all about Pink, who then walks away with the deep disappointment written all over his face. His hands are in his pockets, just like in the park. He's a picture of lonely, dejected hopelessness. And then, Bring the Boys Back Home begins. The drummers emerge from the same fog of his imagination as he did. And here's where the paradigm shifts. Everybody stops in the middle of their manifestations of joy and reunion, and they all begin to sing. Bring the boys back home. Don't leave the children on their own. No, no, bring the boys back home. And in the movie, Pink, as I said, is not singing with them. Instead, he's alone, separate from the crowd, and the crowd is all ranged around and singing to him in the center. This presents the message from a slightly different angle. As if it's an anthem of solidarity coming from all those who have relationships, reunions. Society speaking to and for the forgotten, abandoned, isolated, helpless, and weak ones. So, the image of Pink being abandoned again in Vera, which is in turn mirroring the park scene earlier in the album, that image, we could say, is corrected, or rather, correctly framed. In other words, it's showing us that those members of the community with privilege and family and friends, while they do and should place their priorities with their own familial ties and responsibilities first, they are not, as Pink has always thought, they are not indifferent to him. They are not indifferent to those whom Pink represents. Rather, they do remember. And they not only remember, but they also speak out, or in this case, sing out, for the voiceless. calling to their aid all responsible members of society and all society's resources. This is the Dunkirk spirit moment of the Wall album. Remember the Battle of Dunkirk? I think it was in May and June of 1940 when hundreds of thousands of Allied troops were surrounded on the beach of Dunkirk and they were stuck there. It was expected that they would mostly be lost. And then this miraculous project to rescue them included civilians participating in the rescue efforts with their little ships of all kinds. And it was not just a military moment. It was a moment where civilians, society stepped up and took the actions and made the efforts and gave the sacrifices that needed to be done in order to bring the boys back home. So this is the Dunkirk spirit moment of the Wall album. This is when every able-bodied person with any available resource steps up to the plate to join the effort to bring the boys back home, thereby proving that Pink is, after all, wrong. This societal voice, the voice of the people, speaking on behalf of some of their own, including Pink. And when I say some of their own, it is because some people are in Pink's situation, although not necessarily all. Speaking on behalf of the people, on behalf of Pink, and by extension, his father, and all who are out alone. And not only including him in their circle, but placing him in the center. This has a powerful effect on the outlook of the future. Because unlike so many of the scenes in the movie in which the fog closes in and acts as a barrier, a wall of sorts, in this song, as the chorus progresses, the song moves forwards. The fog gradually clears, the sun becomes visible, even lighting and reflecting off the helmets of the masked soldiers as they are singing, signifying a brighter future, not only for the boys, but also for Pink. Although Pink himself cannot see it yet. He still can't see outside of himself, and when the station clears, he is still there, alone, abandoned, sitting down to listen yet again to the voices of the bricks repeating themselves in his ears over and over. And then we see again that the closing image of the dejected little boy is the inner Pink, because the scene changes and we find the adult Pink passed out in his hotel with the TV on. Well, the scenes at the end of the song are perhaps better left for Comfortably Numb, because they set the stage for that song, so we'll dig into those a bit more next time. But now we have to stop and ask, why is this simple, unsophisticated, four-line anthem the central song of the whole album? It's not only because of its universal message, because of its attractive peace message, but also because of its universal participation. It gathers all civilians, not just the warriors, the non-combatants, the ones doing the laundry, picking up the trash, into another army, an army of peace that is marching and, as I said in my first listen of the song, demanding to bring the boys back home. Now, what would that mean if it were to actually happen? Surrender? We have to ask ourselves the question, because the world right now is involved in some pretty heavyweight conflicts with long-lasting consequences. And so we have to ask, would it mean surrender? Maybe. But that's not Waters' point at all. Because the demand is universal. It's not only for the English, not only for the Western world or any other side. It is for all. And if all of the boys were to be brought back to their homes, it would mean the end of the war. The end of all war. It reminds me a bit of the beautiful European movie Joyeux Noël, which depicts one of the instances of fraternization during the First World War. The Brits, well, okay, they were Scottish. The French and the Germans forgot about the war for a few hours during a Christmas Eve. And I should say that this movie is not just a made-up story. It is a depiction of something that happened many times along the front in that war. And in spite of the war propaganda, all of these different sides and factions realized and took time to experience everyone as humans, as brothers. In that way, the war ended for those few hours or days, not by one party conquering the other, but by fraternizing, by turning from enemies into brothers. And actually, if you remember, to fraternize comes from the Latin frater, meaning brother. Well, in English, that's where we get our word fraternity, which means brotherhood. And you'll also find some form of it in all the Romance languages. Well, in Romanian, it's frate. Now here in Bring the Boys Back Home, the core element in this song is the word home. Remember, the final chord is E minor, which is the home of Hey You when it says, open your heart, I'm coming home. And then this is home. This song does not just demand to bring the boys back from the front or back to their motherland, back to their families. Although, of course, all of that is included. But the place to which they are to be brought is home. And in this context, it means far more than for them to just be in the midst of their families and loved ones in the country to which they belong. This song's solution for the end of all wars is to bring them home, to the reality of human brotherhood, to live as active participants in the strong, healthy relationships and bonds of brotherhood. Well, when all of humanity will come back to that home, that is, come back to our senses and understand that we're all brothers, and that love is the supreme answer to conflicts and problems. Well, it is then that Eve Miriam's dream would come true. Remember, she's the one that said, I dream of giving birth to a child who will ask, Mother, what was war? Now, with all this fresh in our minds, remember again what else Waters said in that interview. It is partly about not letting people go off and be killed in wars. But it's also, and here's the important part, partly about not allowing rock and roll or making cars or selling soap or getting involved in biological research or anything that anybody might do. It's about not letting that become such an important and jolly boys game that it becomes more important than friends, wives, children, other people. In other words, this song is about all activities and pursuits that divide, separate, distract, and otherwise weaken and build walls between the core relationships, the connections built on love, which give our hearts a place of safety and freedom. Don't go filling the empty spaces. Instead, bring the absent ones back home. Don't leave the children on their own. No, no. Well, of course, this line, which is the one which was a sort of mirror image harmonically, it points out one of the reasons why this return home is so important. Those at home are left to suffer in our absence when we go off and fight. And the consequences continue for generations afterwards. But even this line tells us more than that. Because who really are the children? Not only are they the children of the soldiers who've gone off to war, but also they are the soldiers themselves. Because remember, this song is not just part of an after effects of war story. It's a parable of the world, and every individual born on this in this world, on this earth, is a child, is someone's child. We're not just talking about individual families, fathers and sons in a military context, but about society and all its parts. These soldiers are children, barely out of childhood, sent off to do the dirty work for others. They also feel the same loneliness, the same fear. The same pain tears apart both the hearts of the soldiers on the front as well as the hearts of the children back home. Of course, many times the ones who are absent from home are so out of necessity. They do it for the sake of those left behind, even though the doing of it itself is injurious. And so it has to be the mission of the entire community, all members of society, to make it possible for them to return home. And this is Waters' Peace Manifesto for the whole world. A rather powerful one, I have to say. But beyond that, as the central pillar of the entire album, it points us to the fundamental message of the whole work, which is treasure the relationships in which true love exists. Care for them, nurture them, feed and guard them. Handle them bravely, truthfully, and with love. Because this is the home that every person ought to have. This is the way out of the horrors that we find all too often in this world. And as a member of society, when you find an injured, damaged person, do whatever you can to help them on their path towards the restoration of healthy relationships. Even if you can't tear down their wall, even if it's a society and Pink situation where they are so separated they cannot hear each other crying out for the same thing. Even if you can't see really truly who is on the other side of the wall. And as an individual, when you find yourself failing, because we all do, at least sometimes, and we all have our walls, it's human. When you find yourself there, tend to the things, tend to your needs that you have in order to recover and build relationships that will carry you through. And remind yourself that there is an army out there. Is there anybody out there? There is an army out there who is working and calling out for you, even if you cannot hear it beyond your wall. Wherever you are, in whatever situation you find yourself, place the utmost value on this light, this sunshine as it's represented in the movie, of true, genuine, love-based relationships. That is the message of this entire work. Now, back to Pink's story. The closing moments of the song remind us that this is all about himself, his tragedy, his wall. The adult Pink's voice mixes with the choir until, at the very end, He remains the only voice singing as the long final home word carries on and on. And the desperation in that voice is hard to be expressed in words. It grabs me, and I find myself listening to it over and over as it fades into the sum of the wall around him. The voice of the teacher saying, "Wrong, do it again." The telephone, the groupie's question, "Are you feeling okay?" The phone operator saying, "There's a man answering, but he keeps hanging up." All these bricks surrounding him, and through which we hear his manager calling to him. And then, finally, is there anybody out there? Just as his hotel doors burst open. Interestingly, Comfortably Numb's first line, which is the next song, for those of you who've been waiting, is, "Hello, is there anybody in there?" You see, it's all about the one side and the other side of the wall. But this, "Bring the Boys Back Home," this is the central song of the whole album. And it lets us see both sides at once. And what a view it is. It so wonderfully sums up all the pain and tragedy, while also giving us our first glimpse of sunshine, our hope for a better future. And so it is a peace manifesto and an anti-war song, but its core message is that of relationships. It is that of not allowing rock and roll, or making cars, or selling soap, or getting involved in biological research, or anything that anybody might do, not letting that become such an important and jolly boys game that it becomes more important than friends, wives, children, other people. I'll see you next time.